start the webinar, very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Shashika. I represent Kelaniya University Alumni Association in Australia. We are also known as KUAA or KUAA Australia. About today's webinar, from time to time, we organize webinars on topics that are of importance to Sri Lankan community living in Australia, Sri Lanka, and anywhere else in the world. And today's webinar is one of those webinars that we regularly organize to support the community, Sri Lankan community all around the world. So for today, our topic is new developments in Australian permanent residency visa. I think this is something very popular. There has been a lot of demand from KUAA to organize something around this topic. So today, among other things, we will discuss different visa types, number of spaces available for the current financial year, and recent changes in visa categories. So to help us in today's webinar, we have invited Mr. Sanji Caldera. Some of you might have heard Sanji Caldera. So if I may give a quick intro about Sanji, he's a certified Australian immigration consultant, a member of Migration Institute of Australia, and he's a licensed practitioner who has years of experience in this field. Sanji has a migration consultancy firm, also known as Sanji Caldera Associates. It's a multinational immigration consultancy firm, and they specialize in Australian and Canadian migration. Sanji's office, they have offices in Melbourne, Colombo, Dubai, and representative offices in Vancouver and London. Sanji's firm has supported individuals for skilled family, business, and business migration for over 15 years. I think it's also worth mentioning that Sanji has supported KUAA Australia during our emergency response work in the COVID lockdown. Some of you might remember that KUAA Australia supported so many students, hundreds of students during the COVID lockdowns, and Sanji provided free advice on visa-related issues. So that's another reason why we decided to invite Sanji for giving us guidance and advice on this particular subject today. Well, that is a brief introduction about our speaker. And before we start, just to share some practical information, in terms of time, we've got about 1 hour and 30 minutes for today's webinar. And once Sanji finishes his presentation, we will have a question and answer session. We will take your questions that you have sent through to us via email in preparation for the webinar. You can also send in your questions through the chat to our host. Amalia, I think somebody's speaking. We need to mute their microphones. Sorry about that, everyone. So I was talking about time. In terms of time, we have 1 hour and 30 minutes for the webinar. At the end of Sanji's presentation, we will have a questions and answer session, and we will take the questions that you have sent through to us. Apart from that, of course, you can type in your questions to in our chat box, and my friend Amali, she's moderating today's discussion, and she'll keep an eye on the questions that come through. So if there are any questions that has not been covered during the presentation and the Q&A, we'll pick up those questions. That said, it's important to note that we will not be able to answer all the questions given the time limitations, particularly if these questions are of a personal nature, which requires assessment of individual circumstances. So one final note before we start the webinar. Some of you have also asked if we can clarify different provisions of visa in Sinhala. And most definitely, I believe Sanji will be able to do that. But for the benefit of different language speakers attending today, we will run most of it in English. I think that's pretty much what we have in terms of practical arrangements, logistics, and everything. So let's, if everyone has been admitted into the room, I would like to open the floor for Sanji. Sanji, over to you, Sanji. Please take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Sashika. I believe you could hear me. Just a confirmation, Sashika, that yes.
We can hear you loud and clear, Sanjay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very kind and I think a very generous introduction to me. And first of all, I would really wish to appreciate and thank the committee of the KUAA University Alumni Association to give me this opportunity. I think it's a very timely discussion on matters relating to migration, specifically in the year of 2020, the issues that we went through. I would like to just recap of the 2020, the confusion that took place about visas, about border closures, and so forth. It was immense, and people being in different countries, not being able to. So as a migration practice, we had to deal with quite a number of issues and trying to keep up with the rapid changes and that happened with the migration. When I actually talk about developments and changes, it's basically some of the concessions that the government of Australia introduced in order to reduce the pressures and reduce the issues that people had traveling. At the moment, what we know is that permanent residents and citizens of Australia are allowed to come back to Australia with the quarantine requirement of 14 days. They have also extended for subclass 188 business visa holders on a case-by-case basis to come over. And very shortly, much to the relief of many of us, they will be announcing further relaxation of the type of people who could come, and this would be partners who have applied and awaiting their visas or have received their visas, children who have the parents are sponsored and they're waiting to come to Australia, and also prospective partners who need to come to Australia. Unfortunately, as the information that we have received up to now, we don't know whether the parents who have got their permanent residency or getting the permanent residency, whether they could come over. So that's in relation to what has happened at the borders. Amal, if I can go into the planning levels to the next slide, if I may. Okay, so what has taken place is that the impact the COVID-19 had was tremendous. Take a few examples, which I will talk about in detail, and perhaps there'll be some questions. The students, end of 2019, that finished their exams and they were, after a long time, going back to their countries, and then suddenly the borders closed. There are visas where after their studies that they have to be in Australia to apply. They didn't know what to do. And there were certain time restrictions within 6 months. We didn't know what to do with. And after all, they've been studying in Australia for a very long time. There were other temporary migrants which had to lodge their visas onshore, and they were offshore. They couldn't come back. One of the most affected were the students who sort of work part-time, and many in the hospitality industry were very severely affected. And I remember the KUAA university coming into their rescue, providing them as much relief that they could. And the little what we could do is giving some free advice, free consultation to those affected people. And last but not least, the people who are on subclass 482 visas. This is a temporary skill shortage visa, and one of the visa requirements have been you must be working full time. They didn't have work, and they were not entitled to the job keeper or the job seeker allowance. So they had to find alternate employment, like the courier services increased, the cleaning services increased, and they had to move in. Now, we have a theory because of this, they'll stop migration. No, unfortunately, Australia has been a country that it has been built on having very healthy migration levels, and that will continue. But understandably, the government will be very particular and choose at this time who comes into the country or what are the occupations, and there is a lot of confusion over there going forward. But as a positive, if you look at these levels, as you see, the skill migration is very healthy. That comprises of the independent, the subclass 189 visa, the employer nomination visa. So employer nomination visas also categorized in the skill migration budget. And also we have heard so much about these regional visas, state-sponsored, I'm sorry for the spelling mistake out there, state-sponsored and business visas. Then comes the family. Now, obviously, when a person migrates to Australia, we're talking about a young person, they get married from their country, they want to get their partners down, and we have what we call the parent migration, where they would want to get the parents down. So as you see, it is quite healthy, and they are maintaining quite high levels of numbers, adding up to almost 160,000. So that's a very positive note. So let's go on, going on to the next slide, and let's see how who got affected and what were the developments that took place, what are the concessions that took place. I think one of the main areas were for the students. For the new students, what could they do? So as I said, in December 2019, most of the students, they finished their studies and the holidays coming up, and they return to their countries for a holiday and to come back and avail themselves to a 2-year work visa, which is commonly known as a temporary resident visa. And that is, of course, we have what we call the graduate work visa and the post-study work visa. So what the concession that took place was that if you were overseas between 1st of February 2020 and 19th of September 2020, that means this is the time that we really, even still we can't, but during that time, if we couldn't come back to Australia, they were allowed to lodge their visas of overseas. So as we know, students who study for 2 years, whoever studies at a bachelor's or a higher level, get a 2-year work visa. But if they work, if they study long years, in the sense as a PhD student, they would get a longer post-work study visa, which can be up to even 4 years. Now, but the rule was that we needed to apply within 6 months or before their visa expired. So many of the students who would have gone back, they would have had their visas expiring on the 15th of March. They were really planning to come back and they couldn't. So it was a very welcoming change, very welcoming concession that was given for students to say, look, don't worry, apply from overseas. And they also went on to the extent of saying, look, we will extend the period of that you can apply within even 12 months of completing the studies. So that was quite welcoming, and we have many students who now are applying from offshore because of these really, really good concessions. I feel the country, the government has not let down the students and given them the opportunity of coming back to Australia and using the subclass 485 visa to get ready for the permanent residency, get ready for any other visas. I have made a note there recently, it was just a few weeks back, that they even announced another visa, the second 485 visa. Now, this is another very good initiative by the government to get people into regional Australia. So, should you have studied and in a regional area and continue to live in a regional center, you were allowed to extend your subclass 485 visa by 1 year. So, the requirement is that you studied. Let's say you studied in Bendigo or Ballarat or in or a Warrnambool University, but also continue to live in those areas. You were allowed to have another 1 year. Now, the major regional centers we're talking about here is such cities like Perth, Adelaide, and the Gold Coast, and so forth, where you would be given 1 year. But any other area, any other regional area, you could have also got 2 years if you have studied and at least continue to live and work in those areas for. So very, very good initiative by the government. And finally, for students, is that now what happened was in 2020, none of the students who got their visas or who applied for new, they couldn't come to Australia. So there was a new initiative once again brought saying, look, once you start studying and registered within an Australian university with a certain cost number, the time that you would spend studying online from Sri Lanka or from any other country will be considered as if you have studied in Australia. Another very good initiative, because we don't know, there could be students who may have studied now for almost 1 year or perhaps 6 months, and we still don't know how long they might have to study. But when they do come to Australia, the time that they had spent will be considered. So that is pretty good news for students, and we also encourage students to start. Don't worry about the borders being closed. Start the universities have a really very good system of having online a good online education system. One thing I must mention, as I said, the temporary graduate visa is a graduate work visa and a post-study work visa, that is where at bachelor's or higher level. But if a student was doing at a diploma level, the second 485 visa is not, I'm not too sure why they brought that law, but the second 485 visa is not for any student who completed a trade course or a diploma. It is for students who completed a bachelor's or higher level, or master's or a PhD in regional Australia. So that's, I think, covers up a little bit about what happened to students, and let's move on to what happened to the other temporary residents. Right, and so we have the temporary residence concessions too. So the subclass 489, actually this subclass 489 for people who are currently looking at these options, this was very similar to the subclass 491 visa that we have now. So what happened here also is that when you satisfy the 3 years or the 2-year requirement, whatever they applicable, they went offshore. Hang on, they were not permanent residents or citizens, so they couldn't come back. They couldn't continue their residency requirement, and they couldn't complete their working requirements. So generally, the rules were that you needed to have lived in Australia for 2 years once you got this 489, as opposed to the subclass 491 where you had to live for 3 years in regional Australia. But how could you live, because they have just gone out for a holiday and been not being able to come back, and how can they work for 12 months again when they are offshore? So for those residents, temporary residents who were offshore, couldn't come back, they were allowed to apply for the visa offshore, because and that was what we call the subclass 887, the permanent resident visa, after staying in regional Australia for 2 years. So they said, look, they will add whatever the number of years that you have already, they'll have another 6 months to their residency in Australia. That is 6 months that they would have stayed out offshore. They would add as if they lived in Australia. And the work requirement, if they had, let's say, worked for 11 months or 10 months, that would have been good because they reduced it for 9 months. Now, the onshore residents obviously didn't have that issue because they were living in Australia, but they may have lost their jobs because of COVID. So therefore, what took place was they said, look, okay, fine. If you had completed 9 months of work, that was okay. Now, that was specifically for subclass 489 holders. But I think the real impact came when, for the famous, the 457 that we have all heard about, the 482 visa, which is called the temporary skill shortage visa, where an employer other than medical doctors could only work for the particular employer who sponsored you for the visa, for the 482 visa. Now, we know how many people were out of jobs and what could we do? But again, they were granted some concessions, as I say in this slide, full-time work requirements to qualify permanency through the subclass. So these people who are going to apply for the 186, while is on the temporary skill shortage visa, if you couldn't work due to COVID, they would not consider it as a breach of visa condition where you were supposed to be working full-time and for the particular employer. And when they went to apply for the subclass 186, the permanent resident visa, they also had the privilege of any times that they couldn't work being considered as if they have worked. So yes, these are some of the issues that our temporary residents had, and I'm discussing some of the developments and the concessions that they did get. I will very quickly touch, Amali, if you can please have my next slide. This is just an indication of the general skill migration. So I'll go through some of these very briefly, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who have some questions on their personal circumstances, which I'll endeavor to answer. And please feel free, as Sashika said, that if you want me to explain something in Sinhalese, I'm happy to do that. So the subclass 189 skilled independent visa, this is one of the most difficult visas. Let's not make any excuses. We have very low quotas, and I can't remember in the last couple of months for me, my clients getting invitation. It is very low, and we really should not really depend, at least in the short term, on this particular visa. So this is a visa for the people who are not familiar, uh, people who have an occupation in the medium to long-term skill shortage list. Those are the people who could apply for the subclass 189. It is extremely competitive. I have seen people even at 95 or 100 points sometimes struggling to get an invitation, but certainly in the last few months, it has been so. I can't understand the rationale. I felt that people who had some very good points, living in Australia, working, why wouldn't they be given the opportunity? With they're talking about there's so much the high level of quotas that I was talking about, almost 80,000, and for these people, who are some people who have even been gainfully employed, but unfortunately that's a law. The subclass 190, the skilled nomination, this is where the states, all the states in Australia and the territory, when I talk about the territory, we talk about the Northern Territory and the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, participating in the migration process. So what simply the rationale here is, they try to understand the skill shortage in their areas, and then they bring out specific lists, they bring out specific requirements. So every state is completely different. So if somebody came and asked me, I'm an accountant, what could I do? Which state? I can't give a correct answer. We have to do quite a bit of research individually. Coming to say that, I needed to say that in the recent past, I couldn't give one solution to two people, because it was very specific solutions that we had to come up with and advise students, so and people who are offshore and onshore people. So the 190 is a permanent resident visa, but the requirements are very, very stringent, because the state has their own rules in relation to the occupation, in relation to how long they are living in that state, whether they are gainfully employed. So it's completely different from state to state. And the 491. So the 491 is similar to the subclass 190, but it's not a permanent resident visa. It's a provisional visa which is given for 4 years but with the participation with the state governments. The state governments will participate. Again, they'll want to know in which regional area, what are the occupations that are required, and that is how these set of rules and regulations are developed. In fact, the process of applying for the subclass 190 to the subclass 491 from state to state is different. Let's take an example. Let's take Victoria, and they say now they have brought in we had what we call the expression of interest. Yes, we know the expression of interest, and we nominate Victoria as the preferred state that we want a sponsorship. Now, on top of that, we have got a registration of interest. So what do you mean by registration of interest? Yeah, we go into the website and register our interest and await their decision. So there's a lot of uncertainty for people whose visas are running out, and especially majority of them are subclass 485 visa holders. Now, we also have in the 491, we also have, I have mentioned in this slide, family sponsorship. So if you have your brother, sister, uncle, auntie, grandfather, or cousins living in anywhere in Australia other than Melbourne, Sydney, and Sydney and Brisbane, they can sponsor you so long as you have an occupation which is in the medium to long-term skill occupation list. But I won't hold my breath. Again, you get 15 points, so that's very good. So the points go up, but they are hard to come by. So that's about general skill migration. And my next topic, which I'm going to touch on, is the employee nomination scheme. And Amali, if I may please request you to have the next slide. When a person asks me, how do I apply for permanent residency? Majority of the time, I can't really immediately suggest the subclass 189 or the 190 visas that we are talking about, or the 491, which is not a PR visa but leading to a permanent resident visa. There might be a lot of steps or stepping stones or other visas that they should be considering. And one of the fundamental things what I tell is, it is very hard when someone comes and says, Sanjay, my subclass 485 visa is coming to an end, 6 months more, what do I do? It's a bit too late, because that is why one of the policies that I have is that all my subclass 485 visa holders, I assist them through the process, but one of the things I said, sit down, you need to talk to me. 485 is something temporary, that the time goes on, this is what you should be doing. And that advice is very specific to the individual, to the occupation, to their work experience, what they should be doing. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit about these visas. I'm not going to go into detail. I think we should get on to our questions and answers very soon. And therefore, I'll run through this, and if I could have approximately five minutes so that I could run through this fairly quickly. A training visa is about where you don't have enough work experience and also running short of work experience to apply for, let's say, subclass 482. It's a very good tool to have. It is a traineeship that you get sponsored by an organization under a experience. If you're a trainee accountant under an accountant or a trainee IT person, a very useful visa to have, and it is through a training plan. And then it also gives you time to build up some work experience to really get onto other visas. I want to say that there can be some confusion about work experience on a trainee visa can be used as work experience only for some certain visas, simply for the 482, which we know about, which has to have 2 years of work experience. Now, what we say is, let's talk about a young graduate who studies in Australia and gets 2 years. How can one get on and get 2 years of work experience to move on to a subclass 482 visa? We know the 189s and the 190s are so hard. This is the most important visas that we talk about. 9 out of 10 clients of mine have to go through these. So it's so important at the beginning of you're getting your 485 to have that discussion, so that we use the 24 months very wisely to look at these visas and carve a pathway for permanent residency. The 482 visa requires 2 years, and it's very hard when a student comes out and suddenly gets a job, because their 2 years are run out. So that is where the training visa comes in. The work experience that you get on the training visa could be used to fulfill the requirements of the 482s, the work experience requirement, but it can't be used really for the permanent residency of 1 year working in Australia. Now, why do we apply for a 482 visa? A 482 visa has, again, short-term and long-term. I won't go into too much in detail, but if your occupation is in the medium to long-term list, then and work in that organization for 3 years, but also could go into a 186, so the employer can sponsor you for permanent residency. In fact, if you work for 3 years in that organization, we call it the transitional, but if you had some other work experience, perhaps overseas, so long as you got 3 years work experience, an employer can sponsor you for permanent residency so long as it's in the medium to long-term list. And anyone who has an occupation in the short-term list could not use the 186, but can use the 494 so long as their employer is in regional Australia. And that too, after 3 years, can move on and get permanent residency, which is the new visa, which is coming in November 2022, which is the which is, we call it the 191, which is very similar to the subclass 887 visa. So that the 494 after 3 years feeds into the 191 visa. And if you can recall, in the previous slide, I had the subclass 491 visa, which also feeds into the subclass 191. The 494 and the 491 visas came into effect in November of 2019. And well, finally, this 187 may not really be applicable because it is closed, but it is open for anyone who's been on a subclass 482 visa and their employer is in regional Australia. It's a permanent resident visa, which was very popular. It has been closed, but for the transitional applicants, it is still available. I would not go into too much. I just very briefly touched on these visas, and I would like to go through a few more slides, if I may, so that we can move very quickly into questions and answers. I'm sure that you have many questions for me. So Amali, if you could go into I would like you to, one thing perhaps that may have not been mentioned, this particular webinar is being streamed live on the Kelaniya University Alumni Association Facebook page and the Sanjay Kalve Associates Facebook page. And if you do log on to our website or Facebook, we have a very interesting monthly newsletter. We spend a lot of time, my senior staff, collecting, and it's a very interesting read. It takes the form of a magazine, and please feel free to have a look at it, and you can even subscribe so that we send it to you on a monthly basis. I have also extended a very detailed, free initial consultation for people who have participated in these webinar organized by the Kelaniya Alumni Association, and also, and that free consultation is not about a 10-minute or 15 minutes. I'm happy to go through and spend maybe half an hour or even more if it's necessary. It's obligation free. And should you engage our services, I've also to help our community who have gone through some difficult times, to also provide them with a 10% discount of the professional fees. But if they can also please, just to have some control, quote the promotional code. And Amali will go through a few contact details, which is available on our website. And we will, and I'm sure you, once you on to my website, we will have these details. And let's come on to the questions and answer session. Sashika would take those questions, and he will look at questions that will benefit all our audience as much as possible. But please, there'll be some questions that I would be specifically able to answer, and I'm happy to take it on board. And myself or one of my staff will come back to you. Yeah, thank you very much for that initial session. Now, Sashika, across to you for
thank you so much, Sanjay. Thank you so much, Sanjay. I think it was a very detailed presentation. I mean, I fully understand that it is a lot of details that you have to cover. You know, talking about just one category of visa, you can, I'm sure you can talk maybe a few hours, just one category of visa. We've actually received quite a large number of questions in preparation for the webinar. Many participants sent questions to our Facebook page as well as our email address, and I've tried to cluster them into different categories that you just covered, like different visa categories. So what I'm going to do, maybe I will pop some of those questions for you to answer, and in the meantime, it will be great if you can also put any questions that you have in your chat box, in the chat box. As I mentioned earlier, my friend Amali is watching the chat box. So your questions, if they are of a generic nature, we might be able to bring them up to discussion to the room. All right, Sanjay, let's start with the basics. One of the questions we've had is, what is a generalist, what is a skilled occupation list? If you can clarify what is a skilled occupation list, that would be good.
Yes, okay. Like I have touched on this. We have got so many various skill occupation lists, but the three main skill occupation lists is what we call the medium to long term skill occupation lists. These are skill shortages in the whole of Australia, and that is where the subclass 189 comes in. And then we have, and that comprises of about 180 of memory, and then we have another approximately 250 plus occupations which fall into what we call short-term skill occupation list. So it's only that particular type of subclasses can that we have to use in order to get a visa. The 491 visa. The 491 visa, anybody in the skill occupation list must apply for a 491 or perhaps a 190, where that is where the states get involved. And we also have a regional occupation list, mainly from mostly for the employer sponsorship. And in that we have got what we call states list. So we won't go into that, but the department has put out what we call a priority occupation list, trying to combat things of economic development and to address COVID. So there are lots of the medical professions are there, and from the IT, by memory, software engineering, the chief executive manager, I believe the analyzed programmer. So if anybody can go into, it's a very useful list, because if your occupation falls into the priority occupation list, generally as a rule of thumb, you get priority.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Sanji. Maybe we can then go into discuss about the regional visas. I know that you clarified this a little bit when you discussed temporary graduate visas, the advantages of moving to regional Australia, and the points that could bring into the visa. So some of the questions that we've received include, one of the participants here have asked us, I am unable to get an invitation to my subclass 189 visa since I don't have enough points. Should I go to a regional area?
Yes, that's a very common question that is posed. So here is a situation, as I said, the applicant has got quite a lot of points on the 189 visa, and 189 means his occupation is, we take it for granted, is in the medium to long term list, and he or she is not getting an invitation. What do we do? Now, the important thing is timing. To understand that one is not getting an invitation, and we need to come to terms with that early in the 485. And going to regional Australia is not a solution. So for certain people, I'll say you must go to regional and get it. It is not so. This is where we move away from the general skill migration because we don't have any control over that, at what time the department will give us an invitation. When will the state government sponsor me? We don't have. And that is why I advise strongly that you must attempt to work in your field, even to sacrifice. You might have had a job that is not in your field and getting good income, but you must move on to your field of occupation. And it may be hard, but it can be. A skilled person in Australia will and can find if they're determined. And you need to start talking to an employer. That is where you don't necessarily have to go to regional Australia, because there is a balance. If you try to apply for a job in regional Australia, the competition is less than trying to apply for a job in Melbourne and Sydney. Then on the other hand, if you go to a regional Australia and get a regional job, there are more opportunities opening up, but there are less jobs in specific areas. So it is a balance. Excuse me, it's not necessary for you to go. It's an individual case, Sashika, that whether you have to go to a regional area.
Right. So again, I think the key message is that we'll have to assess the individual circumstances I think the key message is that we will have to assess the individual circumstances before determining if somebody has to move to regional Australia to get more points, right?
It's
Is
a
that
good, it's a
your...
good thing to apply. Anyone should apply for a balance of metropolitan and regional. But there'll be some, I would say, and depending on what type and where their visa is, that you must go and get a regional job.
Right, right. All right, Sanji, then I think with clarity established on that, let's move on to the other set of questions. We've received a whole lot of questions around English language requirement. I think that's one of the key criteria which you can score points for the permanent residency visa. Some of the questions, most of the questions we have received are around recent changes that happen in the band scores in the PTE examination. If you can please give us a bit of understanding about any changes that took place to the PTE examination.
Yes, look, there is not enough evidence, and I sympathize with the applicants and migration agents ourselves. This came back in December, where there is PTE and the IELTS. These are two examinations that we use to get our points, and we will say in the past IELTS 6 each equals 50 points of PTE, and IELTS 7 equals 65 on their board. But PT has changed some rules, but I've even checked today, it's not really still appearing in the immigration websites. I may be wrong, but it is not. But what has actually taken place is at the bottom end, where I'll take an example. If you had to get English IELTS 6, applicant who takes up the PT exam would have had to take 50 points, but it has been dropped down, I believe, of my memory to 46. A person who should have got vocational English, which is 35, as a few points have been dropped. Let's go to the other scale, where a person had to get IELTS 7. Previously, the PTE equivalent score was 65. Now that's been pushed to 66. And finally, IELTS 8, there are times that we need to get IELTS 8-ish. Previously, PTE score was 79. That has been put to 84. But I have to warn, I believe that the department is not strictly enforcing, and we have yet not, it's too early days to say from when. Well, students have already applied. What happens to them? A person is just about to apply. What happens to them? So we would get some more information very shortly on this one.
Thank you for that, Sanjay. I'm looking at the chat box and I can see at least a couple of questions coming through about IELTS as well. If you can please clarify what is IELTS minimum grade required for skill migration? If you can give us a short answer for that.
I'm sorry, Sashika, could you please, I didn't hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, and what is IELTS minimum grade required for skill migration?
Yes, for any permanent resident visa, the minimum IELTS requirement is 6 in each band score. And well, that previously was 50 on PTE in each band score. I believe it has dropped to 46. I may be wrong. Yeah, in each band score. So that is for permanent residency. It is a must. Right. And it doesn't actually at that level. We don't even attract any points for the general skill migration. But even for employer sponsorship, 6 is required for the purpose of permanent residency. But for the purpose of employer sponsorship, other visas like the 482, it is less. At only a vocational English is required.
Okay, Sanjay, maybe one final question about language proficiency. There has been a number of questions about partners' English language capabilities. So is it a must? Is it a must that the partner score the same level, or what's the requirement for the partner's English if the partner cannot score the same level?
Yes, good, excellent question. I'm going to elaborate on this. I'm going to take one step, Sashika. I hope I don't confuse my audience. If you're claiming points for your partner, the partner must have a minimum score of 6 each, or 50 or 46 under the current rules. They must get 6 if you want to claim 5 points for the main applicant. However, if not, the partner must have a score of what we call functional English, 4.5 average. 4.5 average, I'm not too exactly sure how much that there is a table where it will go on to, I think, 28 or 29 on PTE. Now, when a partner is trying to comply with the English requirement, the partner has other opportunities. If they have studied in tertiary education for many years in English, if they've had their secondary education in English, so forth. So there are quite a number of criteria that you don't necessarily have to do the English test for their partner to satisfy the English requirement. And if everything fails, then unfortunately there's a fairly significant amount that is considered tuition fees and have to pay for to the department.
Right. Thank you so much for that clarification, Sanji. And then we have a lot of questions specific to different circumstances, and we thought that we'll pick some of these questions which are at certain level generic nature.
Yeah.
One of the webinar participants is asking, my occupation is accountant. Can I get Victorian state government sponsorship?
I have to admit, Sashika, if there were any other questions that have been asked by me more often, this is one of them. No, see, I'll go back a few steps. The straight answer is no. However, having said that, there could be opportunities, there were opportunities, and I'm not too sure in the future, if you were secured in a good regional employment as an accountant, there was an opportunity for the subclass 491 visa in regional Australia, so long as it was a genuine position and been working in there. But if an accountant does come and ask me that question, and hopefully they ask me early stages of their 485, I assume that when people ask me this question, especially when they're unsure that they are on a 485 visa or perhaps other temporary visas, what I would strongly suggest is do not rely on state sponsorship currently, because at the moment, even the Victorian government is more concentrated on medical research, agribusiness, and occupations in those really occupations that the economic growth has to take place. So if you're an accountant, what I would say is do not please rely on any state sponsorship. Again, majority of my clients are going through employer sponsorship. Remember, an accountant is required in any organization. So have confidence that, and it depends on how hard you look for work. And again, as I said, you don't have to go regional, look at the city and regional equally. If you get a job in regional, jobs are less competitive, the city jobs are more competitive, and then work through the 407 visa if you have less than 2 years of work experience, and then go on to the 482. Remember, there are caveats on the 482. If you're going to work in an organization on a 482 visa, that organization, for accountants specifically, the turnover should be $1 million and they should have more than 5 employees. Just to say that, why do you need an accountant if it's smaller than that? So, no, please don't rely on state sponsorship as an accountant. Get into your work stream as soon as possible. Employers are happy to sponsor you because it's a win-win situation.
Okay, Sanjay, thank you very much. I think that's more about somebody who's already having some sort of having experience in the field of accountancy. What would be your advice for those who are newly graduated in the field of accountancy and IT?
Yes, that's. I have to repeat the same answer is that if they don't have any work experience, accountants can get a full skill assessment without any work experience should they get IELTS 7 each or the PTE equivalent of 65 or 66 or whatever the current scores. But IT graduates who do not have any work experience cannot get a full skill assessment. Why do we need a full skill assessment? To apply for the permanent resident visa. So you need to have 1 year of work experience, and I highly recommend to discuss this with your migration agents and move on to a professional year very soon, because if you don't find a job in a year's time, but if you have done your professional year, you can use that, you know, for your skill assessment process. So what I would highly recommend is, they are the most vulnerable who don't have work experience from even offshore. They must secure and look hard to secure a job in their occupation or a closely linked occupation. And by that, they have 2 years, but at least after the first year, they should, within the first year, if preferably, they should get into a job. And then if they don't make the points, it's be very hard for them to make 95 or 100 points. Your options are through the employee nomination. There can be possibility of a state sponsorship, but you cannot rely on that because you don't have control it. What you have control is to work with the employer and discuss with that employer about whether it's a 407 or it is a 482, and to go on. Very, very important. Please do not use the 485, or you have to use the 485 wisely. From the day you finish your exam, you need to get into it, because you'll have to work full time.
Right. Thank you very much, Sanjay. I think we are getting a lot of questions. Amal is alerting me that we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. And most of the questions, it seems, are related to individual circumstances. And as Sanjay clarified, and I clarified at the beginning, it might not be entirely possible for us to give perfect answer.
We'll try to help. We'll try to help as many, Sashika, in the circumstances. But I'll leave it to you and to see whether you can post some questions that will be beneficial to the entire audience.
Absolutely. So what we are doing is we'll try our best to pick up some of the generic type of questions, and we have about 30 more minutes left in the webinar. So Sanjay, maybe if we move on to the temporary visas, one of the participants has asked, my subclass 485 visa, temporary resident visa, is coming to an end, and I have not got an invitation. What can I do?
Yes, I think I touched on this a couple of times before. It is better late than never, we call it. We must, a person who has that 485 visa, there could be a situation where they have got a job in their occupation, but not got invitation because of the points. Or scenario number 2 is that they're not working in their occupation and obviously not getting an invitation. So if a person is working in their occupation or a closely related occupation, I will explain what a closely related occupation is for many of you, because it is a very loose term, but the department has something very specific in place for what we call a closely related occupation. It is extremely important that, as I said, do not rely, but please work with your employer and explain the situation. And if you are working and you're doing a good job, and I believe majority of the employers will be more than happy to give you that opportunity of a 407 visa, which I talked quite a bit, or the 482 if you have had 2 years work experience. Now, my advice to go into a student visa is a matter of last resort. This is something I dislike most. They don't have to ask me for migration advice. It's a very sad thing that, yes, there are a number of people who have forced to go in to further study. Now, I would like to really emphasize the pitfalls in that. Is one thing the department gets very concerned why you want to study further. Sometimes you might be studying something that is of no use to you, and as soon as you start studying, you are then confined to 20, 40 hours a fortnight. You're spending a lot of money, and you do not get another 485 visa. Very important, you do not get another 485 visa unless and otherwise you have your spouse moves on to the second student visa, so that it gives you a little bit of time, and then of course your spouse can apply for another 485 and then you can be a part of it. So hopefully that your a person in the audience has a job, and it's very important to talk. And if you don't know what to ask the employer, please feel free to contact me and explain the situation. There are many times I'm on the phone trying to convince an employer to please give that opportunity to the employee, and explaining to them their obligations very clearly, so that they're willing to sponsor them.
Thank you, Sanjay. I think you answered that question. Just a bit of clarity, maybe if I add a little bit an additional question on the same lines.
Yes.
If somebody is on the temporary resident visa and also have a permanent job here, would it be a better option for them to apply 189 visa over to 190 visa? What would you recommend? So that person is on a temporary visa and has a permanent job.
So the question is, Sashika, if I may, I lost that first part. They are gainfully employed in their occupation. Am I right?
Yeah, they have a permanent job.
So they have a permanent job and they're gainfully employed. What visa should they apply to? Again, to apply for a subclass 189 visa, first criteria is you have to be in the medium to long-term list. Right. And can you apply for 189 just because you have an employer? No, you're still subject to the quotas. You're still subject to the very low annotations. So therefore, you cannot apply for a 189. Let's go to the 190 then. Can I apply for a 190? Yes, I can, but I'm again restricted with what the individual state governments would want. You have been working in your occupation for 6 months, but you should be in this list. So much and so forth. And again, there's a competition there. So in that context, if you are gainfully employed permanently, whilst you parallelly have an expression of interest for a 189, for a 190, and if it's a regional employer and you're living in regional Australia, a 491, you should start talking to your employer about sponsoring you. If you have got less than 2 years for the 407, if you've got 2 years plus for the subclass 482, and if you have got 3 years plus, let's say that you've got some work experience from offshore, you did a master's here, but you did a bachelor's and got some work experience before you came to Australia. Think about a subclass 186, so long as in the medium to long-term list. If your occupation is in the short-term list, then you must get an employer in regional Australia for the subclass 494 visa. However, you can work on a 482 visa in metropolitan, in Melbourne or Sydney or anywhere, but that will not lead to PR. You'll get 2 years and you might be able to extend for another 2 years. So you can buy time by working, but that if your occupation is not in the medium to long-term list, your employer cannot sponsor you for permanent residency on the subclass 186 visa. So right, very important if you have a job to talk to your employer.
Right, thank you for that clarity, Sanjay. We got one question about the skilled occupation list as well. You clarified what that is at the beginning. The question in the chat box is specifically about doctors and IT systems analysts. Do you think these two occupations are in demand in Australia right now? So the doctors,
you said doctors and
IT system analyst.
IT system analyst. Yes, look, medical doctors are always in very high demand. It has been always in high demand. Medical doctors have a very unique way of coming into this migration. Majority of the medical doctors, Sashika, come to Australia on what we call the subclass 482 visa.
Right.
And let's say general practitioners, and they have to get their APRA registration, and then they work, and they are also determine the amount of supervision that they should be undertaken. There are various exams, so it is highly sought after. But there is a catch when they move into applying for the permanent residency. Now they could apply through the 189 or 190, but generally when they're working on the 482 visa, it appears that their employer is willing to sponsor them for permanent residency. Before they do that, they need to, of course, there are tests, various tests called the MC1 test and MC2 test, but MC1 test will give you ability of working on a 482, but MC2 test will give you the actual full registration. Now, the medical association and APRA, they will determine whether this particular applicant can get a registration without any conditions. And only if you get a registration without any conditions, one can apply for permanent residency. And also not forgetting that even when an employer sponsors, the nomination sometimes do not get approved if they are not in an area of need. So there are some very specific rules, but excellent opportunities for medical doctors and specialists in Australia. It has always been, it's in the priority list, even nurses, it's in the priority list, and it's in the medium to long-term list. It's in all lists. Everybody wants to have doctors. We have a scarcity, but extremely stringent assessment criteria for them.
Right. Thank you, Sanjay. If we may just jump back to the questions around students. We have at least 2 or 3 questions coming in. One is very specific to the current circumstances around the pandemic. So the student here is mentioning that I had to reduce the study load. It was an option given by the university. Now it has added 1 more year to complete my master's degree. And I'm wondering if this is going to affect applying for temporary resident visa or permanent residency visa.
So yes, again, I will repeat the question so that I understand. It is that the applicant reduced the workload and because the pandemic studies were affected, so can't complete the studies, need another 1 year extra.
Yes,
the department is very department is very understanding. What you need to do is, first and foremost, you need to discuss with your educational institution and extend and get what we call a COE, which is a certificate of enrollment, and we then go to the department before the current visa is finished. You apply to the department, but you give an explanation why you want the registration. Sometimes there are students who fail exams, medical condition deferred, but what they do is then they extend their visa. Now, that will not impact your temporary residency, the 485 visa, so long as you've got the proper number of subjects that you have undertaken, you've completed your studies, and the study load is equivalent to 2 years of full-time study in Australia. Right. It is very unlikely even that the department will refuse a visa for extension if it's genuine.
Okay. Thank you, Sanjay. We've also got a question, very specific question about the student is starting their own business. So if a student has his or her own business, would it be helpful for them to apply for permanent residency?
Look, the only time that one starts a business, this was introduced some time ago in Tasmania for the Tasmanian regional visa under the 489. I believe it's still there, where you start a business, but you have to start a business in your area of in your occupation. So let's say that if you're an accountant, accounting practice, or if you're a chef, a restaurant, and so forth. So there were a few people who in Tasmania got their temporary subclass 489. This is the equivalent to the 491 visa. But recently, none of the other states participate in this, but recently, Queensland government announced a very interesting opportunity for the 491 sponsorship. So for 491, we have various different pathways, but the Queensland government said that if you buy a business and invest 100,000 Australian dollars in a business that is in regional Queensland. I'm talking about regional Queensland, even the Gold Coast is regional. Various kinds of regional parameters are there, but or the Sunshine Coast, but not in Brisbane, just out of Brisbane. If you invest in a business and buy it, you have to buy it. You can't start it. You have to buy the business from another owner for $100,000, or you buy it for a lesser amount and develop the business up to $100,000. Operate the business for 6 months, and you can prove that your knowledge, you don't have, doesn't have, like in Tasmania, you don't have to have it in the same occupation, but that you have the knowledge running, and you also employ an Australian for minimum 20 hours. When I say Australian, means Australian permanent resident or citizen in that business for at least 20 hours over the last 20 hours a week over the last 6 months. They will consider a subclass 491 visa invitation, but you have to satisfy your occupation and the points and all that, and they will also monitor going forward that you continue with the business. Remember that when you get a 491 visa, it's a provisional visa for 5 years, and you need to satisfy 2 conditions. One, you need to live in that regional area for 3 years. So let's say you bought a business and you run the business for 3 years, but you must also be earning a taxable income of $53,900 for the next 3 years. So yeah, pretty important if you do that, if you buy that business, that of course you can combine income. It's not very clear whether you can combine income, but you need to earn $53,900 taxable income for the next 3 years in order for you to apply for your permanent residency. So the short answer, if I start my business, no. If I buy a business in regional Queensland, yes. But in Tasmania, if you start or buy a business, you can. I stand to be corrected, Sashika, on Tasmania, whether they continue. It's been a long time, so I stand to be corrected. But Queensland, it's a yes.
Great, thank you very much for that comprehensive answer there, Sanji. There's a lot of more questions coming in. Actually, I'm just looking at a question about regional, moving to regional areas that we covered earlier. If you can just maybe give a quick answer about this. So this is student, they're planning to apply for their permanent residency in regional Australia and working there for 6 months. So the question is, do they have to work in the same category, same field, or can they do other type of jobs?
And which state have they mentioned?
They haven't mentioned a state.
Look, it's generally rule of thumb. Rule of thumb is that many of the states would like you to be employed in your occupation or a closely related occupation. Sashika, I want to take this opportunity to explain this closely related occupation, which I think I mentioned. It can be very confusing. Every occupation has an ANSCO code of 6 digits, very, very important, 6 digits. Now, what happens is that any occupations that the ANS code, that's the Australian New Zealand occupation code, they feel that is closely related. What they do is they have the first 4 digits as a similar group of occupations. So let's take an accountant is 221111, and a management accountant will be 221112. So that what you mean by if the first 4 digits of the different occupation that you do is similar to your main occupation, we can consider it as a close related occupation. So just as something that you'll see everywhere. So, and in permanent residency, in state sponsorship. So generally, unfortunately, yes, you need to to get state government sponsorship, the rule is 6 months. Sometimes it can be 12 months for a 190. And you need to show that, I mean, sometimes people say, look, I got an accountant position, I'm okay, I got 6 months, but be very careful. You need to look at the fine print. The state government will look at the genuineness. The state government will look at even the salary that one had got in the last 6 months. Look at the organization. Has the organization just been a mushroom organization to sponsor this applicant? Have they been in business for many years? All that is looked at. So yeah, rule of thumb, 6 months in your occupation. And if that occupation falls into that state list, a very good opportunity to get a 491.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. You clarified one term there, a specific term. Can you also clarify what is a skill assessment?
Yes, look, a skill assessment is, one can even get a permanent residency without a skill assessment if you go through employer sponsorship pathways and go through transitional. I won't go into detail, but let's say rule of thumb is that you need to have a skill assessment. So every occupation that is in the medium to long-term list or the short-term skill occupation list has a designated assessing body to assess the skills and the experience of applicants to assess whether they meet the Australian standard. And this is quite easy when you're Australian qualified, but when you're offshore, it's with thousands and thousands of different education institutions and universities. There are the skill assessing bodies. So for accountants, we have what you call the Chartered Institute or the CPA, and for computers, we have computer related, IT related ACS. So there is a designated skill assessing body. If somebody wants to get a skill assessment for a particular occupation, they need to find out who that assessing body is and go to them, find out the criteria that it can be different. Yes.
Great, thank you, Sanjay. I think in the interest of time, we might limit the number of questions we take. Maybe we can take 3 more questions. Sanjay, would that be okay with you?
I'll be happy to assist, Sashika. Yes, whatever it takes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. So maybe this is one of the questions that we cannot skip. It is about those who are in trade occupations. So what are the ideal options for those who are in trade occupations such as painters, carpenters to apply for permanent residency?
Yes, look, I think I have to admit that I didn't address. I believe trade occupations have excellent opportunity so long as you're genuine. And in that trade, we have seen a lot of people who come for accounting and IT suddenly changing into being chefs. I hope they are passionate about the work that they do. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard just to get a migration outcome to change occupations. Chefs, not cook chefs, are in the main occupation, or motor mechanics, carpenters, and so forth. A majority of the trade occupations do have they are in the list and they are in high demand. I'll go very quickly. You need to study for 2 years, and then you need to work for 360 hours after the first year. That's after certificate 3, and we get into what we call the job ready program. And then once you get your the post-work stream, remember this 485 is different to the people who have studied a bachelor's degree. They don't need a skill assessment, but when you go in the graduate temporary, you must get a provisional skill assessment even to apply for a subclass 485. And remember that occupation must be in the medium to long-term list, so very stringent. So you work 360 hours, your occupation must be in the main list for you to, and it's only 1.5 year visa that you get. And during that 1.5 years, you need to be in the job ready program, working in the field, and get a full skill assessment. And then there are plenty of opportunities but very hard on the 189, 190, but complete opportunity, plenty of opportunities through the employer sponsorships. Because Sashika, I have to say that I speak to a lot of employees in regional Australia. They are struggling to find good employees, good skilled employees. I always tell these people, please, if you know what your job, apply and country people are quite welcoming with whatever the sponsorship that you want. It's very hard to find, and especially chefs are in extremely high demand. I know employees who want chefs willing to sponsor them, do anything, but yeah, so the trade is slightly different.
Fantastic. That's great information, Sanji. Maybe quickly, one final question before I go into the last question about the students. There's a question about the temporary visas. So my temporary visa is expiring soon, and I'm planning to register for another course. Can I go for training visa? What is the possibility that I can go for PR using training visa?
Yes,
So,
yes,
yeah.
that's a really good question that I think again I touched, but I'll go through that again. So you are now on I understand you're on a subclass 485 visa and you want to apply for a 407 visa. A 407 visa has two criteria. One is that either one of them, you can apply for a 407 visa within 2 years of completing your studies. That is not getting the visa. I'm not talking about visas here. I'm talking about 2 years of completing your studies, or at least have worked 1 year in your profession in the last 1 year. Yes. So if you go into a 407 visa, and depending on how many years of work experience you have, you could use the 407 visa to get a 482 visa, and you can use a 482 visa to gain work experience to satisfy the subclass 186 visa, which needs 3 years. It's a process. Yes, so there is, but again, remember, if your occupation is in the medium to long term list, only that I can suggest that to a 186. If not, you can go through the first 2 steps, yes, 407 and the 482, but you need to have a regional employer ready for the 494. One thing that I need to say is not all occupations are available for the 407. There is a separate list which generally comprises of all the medium to long-term list occupations plus a majority of the short-term list. Not all occupations can be used for the 407.
Great, Sanjay. Thank you so much. We are 5 minutes over the time you've given to us, but I cannot, end this webinar without asking one final question from you. So
Right.
maybe one generic question. So if I am a student, I'm recently graduated, and I want to apply for permanent residency visa, I'm getting ready for the process. What is the advice you can give as a migration consultant? How should I get ready for the entire process? What is your general advice?
I said in the last couple of years, I could not give 2 people the same advice. I started from that. You need to think about permanent resident visas almost coming to your end of your studies or very shortly. And it is to get advice from a migration agent. What should I do? Because I know that I'm going to get the 2 years 485. What should I be doing? And that advice will be very specific. If I'll go through 2 scenarios. If your occupation falls into the medium to long-term list, apply for employment both in the city area and also apply for jobs in regional. Have a good balance. If your occupation falls into the short-term occupation list, please concentrate on regional Australia. Then you use the subclass 485 to work anywhere. But you do not think about permanent residency coming to an end of the 485. As you pointed out, you talk about your permanent residency options when you finish your studies. Discuss with us. That's something that I always do. People say, Sanjeev, can you help me with the 485? I said, look, I'll help you with the 485. That's not much of a deal, but I want to sit down and talk to you about your aspirations to become permanent residency. Please take the advice right from now. Don't waste one more day. So again, going back to the question, I have finished my studies. I am thinking about permanent residency. I know I'm going to get a work visa for 2 years. Start talking to your consultant about how do I get about improving and having all the opportunities for permanent residency. And that is why a 485 is given to you by the department to get ready for the permanent residency. And if you must use that wisely.
Great, Sanjay. I think there's lots of information. I think the best thing is to get organized. That's the message I'm getting from you. Start from now, preparation, getting organized, and filtering out the information that we are getting from different sources. Well, I would love to keep going given the amount of questions we're getting, but unfortunately, there's only so much time we have. So I think it's time for us to wrap up today's session. So before I wrap up, before we close the webinar, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to Sanjay and Sanjay's team for accepting our invitation and taking this time to share valuable information with everyone. And thank you, Sanjay. We appreciate it so much. And also, finally, but most importantly, I would like to thank you all for joining today's webinar. We sincerely hope you found this information useful, and we believe that this information will help you to get better organized, get ready for your visa, whatever the category you are applying for, and be successful in getting your permanent residency visa for Australia.
Just a footnote, Sachika, I'm very appreciative for this opportunity given to me by the KUAA University Alumni Association, and your wonderful staff who have been working the last few days together with me. And I believe we'll run many of these very valid topics, and that will help our community. And please keep up the good work. Happy to help and assist in many ways. And most importantly, to all our participants, keep safe.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Really appreciate it. And finally, thank you everyone once again for your participation, your questions, and we look forward to having you in future webinars. But before we close, I just would like to remind you that we will be sending you a quick survey within the next 10 minutes to your email addresses that you registered for this webinar. And please take a bit of time to complete the survey. That will help us to improve the quality of our future webinars. And on that note, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of the weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.